Good morning again. I'm here making part 3 of chapter 46 and I'm looking out my window. It's gorgeous out today. I'm definitely going to want to get outside and take a bike ride or a hike or something like that. I'll be thinking about, look, I'm wearing my Grand Teton National Park shirt. I'll be thinking about the fact that we probably aren't going to go there this summer as planned. We'll see. In any case, welcome back. We're going to talk about the female reproductive system and functioning today in part 3. So what we've got is a picture of the human female reproductive structures, kind of the out-of-body and the in-body experience again on these figures. And, oops, I'll get us to our big version, okay? And we're going to take a look at the female reproductive structures and what they do. Then we'll move into the hormonal control. This is going to be probably a little bit longer video because the female hormonal control is really complicated. So I will try to move through these relatively quickly, but you're going to need to write down what each structure is doing. I want you to know where each structure is located, what it's doing. You should be comfortable enough with this so that you can be comfortable with your body and how it works. Yeah, I just think it's important for Bio 120 students to have this under their belts. Okay, so females develop as females because their gonads kind of by default develop into female gonads if there is no Y chromosome. And if there is no SRY gene on the Y chromosome, then the gonads develop into the female version, which are ovaries, a pair of ovaries in the abdominal cavity, right? So we're going to take a look at the gonads first. Now, the ovaries here in the out-of-body experience, you can see them better a little bit. They're kind of tucked way back in the picture on the bottom there. That's where the ovaries are. They're small. They're a pair of ovaries in the abdominal cavity, and they have two important things that happen here that we definitely should know. One of them is it's the site of oogenesis. It's the site where eggs are made. So I'm going to go to the next slide. We're going to be thinking about what's happening in the ovary, okay, or in the ovaries. Okay, so the first thing we want to write down is the site of oogenesis. That's a funny word. It just means the production of eggs happens here. And so what is this thing? Well, this ovary is kind of a tough protective capsule or tissue surrounding many follicles. So we've got this tough protective capsule surrounding many follicles. What are follicles? Well, follicles are immature egg cells that are surrounded by a bunch of nutritive cells, right? So a follicle is like an immature egg cell with a bunch of other cells around it, okay? And there are lots of these, hundreds of thousands of these follicles in an ovary. They were there since the female was born. They grew and started developing before the baby girl was even born. All right. Now, what happens is once a female reaches puberty, one of these immature follicles starts to develop in one of her ovaries about each month, right? And what that means is that the cell grows from a primary oocyte into a secondary oocyte, and it continues to develop into a bigger structure. All of these nutritive cells and such are growing into are developing. And what's happening with this immature egg is it's going through meiosis. Let's take a look at how that happens, and then we'll come back. Oh, let's just finish this a minute. So what happens is this immature egg develops, I'm just kind of showing you over time it happening, and develops into what's called a secondary oocyte. A secondary, I'm going to put secondary oocyte. A secondary oocyte is ready to be released from the ovary. And it is released from the ovary at some point during what we call ovulation, during the month. That secondary oocyte bursts out of the ovary and is released into the abdominal cavity. And that's called ovulation. So during the first half of the month, the immature follicle develops and grows, and in it develops an egg that can be fertilized. It's called the secondary oocyte. We'll look at that development in a second. And it's released into the abdominal cavity. It's quickly picked up by the fallopian tubes or the oviducts, but in any case, egg production is happening here. What's left behind, all of these follicle cells that are left behind, become their own gland. We call it the corpus luteum. A white body is what that really means. Oops, how do I spell luteum? Luteum. The corpus luteum starts making its own hormones, and that's the second major thing that happens in the gonads here, or in the ovaries, is the production of estradiol. I'm just going to write E. Estradiol is a type of estrogen, and progesterone are made by the corpus luteum. Now, if there is no pregnancy, that corpus luteum over the rest of the month will start to kind of shrivel up and make less and less of its hormones, and eventually it will disappear, okay? So during the course of a month, one immature follicle develops and releases a secondary oocyte in the process we know as ovulation, and the corpus luteum develops and eventually disappears. Corpus luteum is producing estrogen, or estradiol, and progesterone that can support a pregnancy if it happens. So those are the two important things that are going on. I mean, there's a lot of things going on, but those are two things I want you to remember. Let's take a look at that process of oogenesis a minute. Okay, this is a picture that's sort of like what we saw with the male system. And over here, we've got what's really happening, okay? There's also a nice animation that might be worth checking out. Okay, so what happened before baby girl was even born is some germ cells, so that's going to give rise to eggs. A primordial germ cell goes through mitosis to make oogoniums. They go through more mitosis to develop into what's called a primary oocyte that has started meiosis 1 but hasn't finished it yet, okay? Then the baby is born with like 400,000 of these primary oocytes. When she hits puberty, one of these primary oocytes will start developing and complete meiosis 1 and even start meiosis 2. As this happens, there's kind of a little sneaky thing. Usually when we think about meiosis, we say, oh, you start with one cell, you end up with 4 daughter cells. You do with meiosis in ovaries as well, but the daughter cells are really, some of the daughter cells are really small. So as our first primary oocyte goes through meiosis 1, we have 2 daughter cells. One of them has all the cytoplasm. That is going to go through meiosis 2. One of them is tiny and called a first polar body. Then this secondary oocyte starts going through meiosis 2. It stops kind of partway through meiosis 2 and is ovulated. It bursts out of the ovary, okay? If it's fertilized, if a sperm comes along and fertilizes it, it will complete meiosis 2, producing a second polar body that's not worth anything. Typically, it can't get fertilized, it can't develop into a baby or into a fetus, and the other egg, the egg can be fertilized, develop into a fetus over time. Okay. What's happening over here is a picture of the the ovary itself and the follicles, and what's left behind is this corpus luteum that provides estradiol and progesterone as the production of an egg occurs. Okay. Okay, so 2 big things that are happening in the ovary. Now, what's next? Where does the egg go once it's released from the ovary into the abdomen? We move on to the oviducts. The oviducts are also called the fallopian tubes. The oviducts are the tubes or the ducts through which the egg travels from the ovary to the uterus. And so we get this long kind of tube right here that we're talking about. And what it really does is it's not attached directly to the ovary. There are finger-like projections that kind of extend out and around the ovary. And those finger-like projections, called fimbriae, actually will, maybe I should have made some more, will pick up the secondary oocyte as it's ovulated, and then will trap that secondary oocyte so that it is now inside the oviduct. Okay? This is, at this point, the cilia that line the oviduct will slowly move this secondary oocyte toward the uterus, right? So the secondary oocyte is kind of moving along, waiting to be fertilized in the oviduct, right? Usually, if an egg is going to be fertilized, it's here in the oviduct that it happens. So a sperm comes along and travels through the oviduct. It arrives at the secondary oocyte and fertilizes it right here in the oviduct. So fertilization typically happens in the oviduct. This is also the tube through which the egg travels, and the little zygote, or the little fertilized egg, travels, because the egg is eventually, the fertilized egg is eventually going to have to arrive. There's my little egg. It's going to eventually have to arrive in the uterus. Okay, that's where we're moving to next. If you've ever heard of an ectopic pregnancy, that's a dangerous condition. An ectopic pregnancy is where the egg gets fertilized, typically that happens in the oviduct, and an embryo starts to grow, but the embryo implants itself typically it typically implants itself in the uterus, but in an ectopic pregnancy, it implants itself somewhere in the oviduct. And this little embryo starts to grow in the oviduct. And it might grow for a couple of weeks, 2 or 3 or 4 weeks, but then it's not viable. It will never survive. A person with an ectopic pregnancy may develop a high fever, an infection, and have to go to the hospital, have that pregnancy removed, and possibly, if that pregnancy causes the oviduct to burst, that can be very traumatic, it can be very scary, and potentially life-threatening for mom. So this is a terrible situation. One of my friends had an ectopic pregnancy, and she lost then her oviduct. So she essentially had, she lost this oviduct, and that, of course, decreases your fertility if, one of your ovaries is producing eggs, and if this ovary is producing the eggs this month, well, then your fertility drops because it can't be fertilized. And so ectopic pregnancies are pretty scary. Okay, but we're not going to deal with ectopic pregnancies. Now we're moving on to the uterus. So the uterus is a thick, muscular organ that stretches as the embryo develops, because this is the site where the embryo implants itself, right? So let's write a couple of things down. It's a thick, muscular organ. It's about the same size and shape as an inverted pear. That's what they say, right? And it stretches. It's a muscle, and it can stretch and grow and stretch and grow. If you have triplets, it really stretches as these triplets develop, because this is the womb. This is the site where the embryo develops, where the fetus develops, and the embryo implants itself on the uterine wall. You can see how muscular and thick this uterus is, but the embryo is going to implant itself on the wall, and the inner wall, the inner lining of the uterus is called the endometrium. It's a highly vascularized lining that provides nutrition for the young embryo to grow. It provides nutritive support for the embryo for quite a while. and the embryo grows there. If it's not implanted in the uterus, if it's implanted over in the oviduct, the embryo is not going to survive. Okay, the endometrium or endometrial lining, if there is no pregnancy during the month, then that endometrial lining, those cells die off, and because they're richly vascularized, a lot of blood is lost, and the endometrium is shed through the cervix, through the vagina, and that's called a woman's period, right? So that endometrium is shed every month if there is no pregnancy. If there is a pregnancy, then that endometrial lining will stay intact and provide support for the growing embryo. Now, what eventually becomes kind of the source of support for the embryo or the fetus? The placenta, right. The placenta is a structure that's cool, and we'll talk about it in the next video, but that also develops here and attaches itself firmly to a place along that endometrium or along the uterine wall, right? And that supports the growth of the fetus throughout the pregnancy. It takes a couple of months for that placenta to develop, okay? All right, the neck of the uterus is called the cervix, and that cervix has to dilate during birth. If you've heard that, you know, my cervix is dilated, needs to be dilated to about 10 centimeters before the baby can be born. That's the neck of the uterus, and it leads to the birth canal or the vagina, okay? A couple of comments here about a couple of topics that you may have heard about. So let's talk about something called placenta previa. So here's a picture of a little fetus developing well with a placenta that's tightly attached to the uterine wall. And you can see through the umbilical cord the fetus is getting materials from the placenta. That placenta is actually made up of mom and baby tissue, and it's really tightly secured to the uterine wall. Normally the placenta is kind of somewhere away from the cervix. Sometimes that placenta slides around and it can be right over the neck of the cervix. When that happens, it can lead to some bleeding. That's called placenta previa. Many times with placenta previa, the fetus will continue to develop totally normally, and that placenta will eventually shift itself back away from the cervix, and that's good. Occasionally this can be a real problem. When I had triplets, I had 3 babies in my uterus with 3 placentas, and some point during the pregnancy I had placenta previa. Well, it's no surprise because you'd have 3 placentas along that uterine lining, and there's not much room. This situation here is very traumatic and usually fatal for the baby. Placental abruption. If the placenta totally separates from the uterine wall, then baby has no means of survival. Baby can't get oxygen, can't get nutrients, and can die, and that's really horrible. Sometimes the placental abruption is partial in nature, and then typically this is an emergency situation. Okay, one other thing about the uterus that you may have heard about before, endometriosis is a disease that some people suffer from, and it typically causes a lot of pain with menstruation, and I wanted to mention what it is. So typically during a month, the endometrial lining builds up and becomes thick and rich and vascularized, ready for a pregnancy, and then it's shed when that pregnancy doesn't happen. But with endometriosis, the uterine lining, the endometrium, starts to grow, tissue starts to grow in places outside the uterus. So in this picture, we've got endometrial lining or endometrium growing in the ovary or on the outside of the uterus. When that happens, every month the cells die back. And as the cells die back, they're left behind, and scar tissue can build up. And as these cells die back, typically, all of the cells that are lining the lining the uterus can simply be shed. But these cells over here can't be. The endometrial lining being built in random spots gets stuck there, and that causes pain, especially pain with menstruation. Sometimes endometriosis can be surgically removed, or it needs to be. Sometimes if the endometriosis occurs in the oviduct, it can cause blockage of tubes, and that can lead to reduced fertility, and that has to be removed by surgery, etc. Okay, where are we now? We're on to the vagina. So we've covered the uterus. The vagina is the thin-walled, muscular but elastic structure that is the birth canal during the birthing process. So you can see it here. Okay. It has an opening to the external environment, and it's connected by the cervix to the uterus, right? It's the birth canal, and so therefore being stretchy is very important. That needs to allow for the whole baby to get through it. Sperm is also placed here during ejaculation, or during sexual intercourse, and it opens, the vaginal opening opens at what's called the vulva, or the female external genitalia. Okay? The external genitalia in the female is generally called the vulva. The external genitalia includes several flaps or folds of skin called the labia minora and the labia majora that surround the vaginal opening, and it includes the clitoris. The clitoris is analogous to the male penis. It has the structure of a male penis. It's much smaller, but there's erectile tissue. It's the organ of sexual arousal during sexual intercourse, and it's kind of in front of the vaginal opening. Okay. One more thing here, the Bartholin's gland is a small gland that secretes a lubricant during sexual intercourse, and that lubricant facilitates intercourse. You can see it's just caudal to the vaginal opening. Wanted to make one mention of something regarding the external genitalia in females before we move on to functioning. You've maybe heard of something called female genital mutilation, or FGM. This is a mutilation, a type of destruction of female reproductive parts. And throughout the world, and certainly in certain spots of the world, there are many millions of people, women, who have undergone female genital mutilation. In these societies, it's typically a part of the culture, a part of growing up, becoming an adult, and it involves either in early childhood or just before adolescence, the removal or cutting away of parts of the external genitalia. So sometimes it involves the removing of the clitoris. Remember, the clitoris is analogous to the penis. The removal of part of those flaps of skin, or the sewing of them together, right? So sometimes the labia major is sewn almost shut, leaving a tiny little hole for urinating and for menstruation. In all of these cases, we really do consider, the World Health Organization considers all types of female genital mutilation a violation of human rights of girls and women. And it's something that the World Health Organization is working toward getting rid of, trying to remove, trying to separate this type of mutilation from the culture. And talking to different people in different groups and working with them to try to explain this, how dangerous this can be. It's a pretty dangerous event. It can cause bleeding. It can cause infection. It can cause people to not have any kind of enjoyment of sexual intercourse ever during their lives. It's a really scary thing, and so I just wanted to make that mention. I am particularly interested in this. My daughter is from Ethiopia, and when I see that, something like 74% of women in Ethiopia have undergone some type of FGM. It's kind of scary and very, very sad. In any case, I just wanted to mention that. Now we're moving on. You can look this up, or you can talk. I'm sure that you've maybe talked about this in other classes. I know I get a lot of students who talk about it in classes in sociology. Okay. Hormonal regulation of the reproductive systems. All right, now we're going to talk about the female, how the hormones regulate the female system. And this is fun. And so we're going to see how much we can get through before I get really tired, because this one's really tough. Okay, so it turns out that the female reproductive system has to coordinate two cycles. It has to coordinate what's happening in the ovary, the maturation and release of the egg or the ovum from the ovary. That's called the ovarian cycle. The ovarian cycle, okay? That has to be tightly coordinated with what's happening in the uterus. If you're releasing an egg that could be fertilized, the uterus better be well prepared. It better have a thick, rich endometrial lining ready to go when the fertilized egg gets there, right? And so we call this the menstrual cycle or the uterine cycle. So you can put it in either way. I'll put it in as uterine. The uterine cycle involves the growth of the lining of the uterus in preparation for a fertilized egg, and the shedding of the lining if the egg isn't fertilized. These two systems, these two cycles have to be tightly coordinated. If they're not, there will never be a healthy pregnancy. And so we start looking at the hormonal control of the female system, and you go, oh, this is complicated. Yes, indeed, it is complicated. A couple of things to point out about this slide, and then we'll move to a different slide. But there are the two cycles. There's the ovarian cycle and the menstrual cycle. During the ovarian cycle, each cycle is about 28 days, about a month long, okay? And the ovarian cycle can be divided into little pieces, right? First, the follicle has to grow and mature, and then the secondary oocyte is ovulated somewhere around the middle of the cycle, maybe day 10 to 15. And then what's left behind, the follicle develops into the corpus luteum that eventually disappears. Okay? That has to be tightly coordinated with what's happening down here in the uterus. And this is a picture of the uterine lining and how it changes over the cycle. And so we start the cycle actually at day 0 when menstruation starts. That's how we define the cycle start. And the uterine lining is falling apart. It's crumbling. It's getting thinner. The endometrial lining is being shed. That's the period. And then during the proliferative phase, the uterine lining starts to grow and starts to proliferate until about day 14 or 15. That's when ovulation happens. We have to have a rich, well-vascularized uterine lining that's secreting nutrients by the time the egg arrives. And that by halfway through the cycle, we get a healthy uterine lining that's ready to go, waiting for fertilization. If there is no fertilization, we start all back over again. Okay. Now, those two boxes are pretty easy to understand. Every other box up here refers to the hormonal control of these two systems. So here we've got what's happening in the brain and the hormones that are released. And here we've got a set of hormones that are being released from the ovaries and how they're affecting what's going on in the uterus. So we're going to take a look at these hormones and how they affect what's happening in the ovaries and in the uterus, and how we can coordinate the ovarian cycle with the uterine cycle. And so I've decided to draw a flow chart that we can just fill in if we can. And this flow chart essentially represents the whole month of a situation in which there's no fertilized egg, but we can see the hormones that are involved. And the first half of the month is kind of the left half of this flow chart, and the second half of the month is the right half of the chart. And I'll try to point that out to you. But what we're doing is drawing a flow chart that is kind of a picture of what happens on the last diagram, on the last slide, if you will. And so let's try to fill in this chart. Let's begin at the top at the hypothalamus, because the hypothalamus is involved in regulating this whole female system. The hypothalamus is that structure at the base of the brain. We saw it in the male system too. It secretes, and now let's just start with like day 0, if you will. It secretes gonadotropin releasing hormone. I'm going to put down GnRH on top of this arrow, okay? And that gonadotropin releasing hormone targets the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary is that, so you can write down the anterior pituitary right here in this green box, pituitary. Okay. The anterior pituitary is that gland that dangles from the hypothalamus, and it produces a lot of its own hormones. The anterior pituitary early in the cycle now starts secreting FSH, and in parentheses also some LH, okay? But the FSH, what did that stand for again? Follicle stimulating hormone. The FSH targets the ovary. At the ovary, FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, stimulates the growth of a follicle, and a follicle starts growing. Typically one follicle starts growing. So I'm going to write down here, well, at the ovary, one follicle starts growing. Okay, you guys are going to have to do your part in terms of adding more detail, because I can't write very well on this. Using my finger to write on the screen, it's not so good. All right, so we've got the growth of one follicle. When one follicle starts to grow, the follicle starts to secrete some estradiol in very small amounts. Okay, so that's what it says here in this little diagram. The follicle cells start to make their own E. E stands for estradiol, but in small amounts. What that does is that causes a negative feedback. There we go. There's our negative feedback loop to the anterior pituitary. Negative feedback means it's going to shut down or slow down the anterior pituitary. Hey, anterior pituitary, don't release any more FSH right now. Why is this useful? One follicle has started to grow. It immediately starts making estradiol that targets the anterior pituitary and says, oh, don't release too much more FSH. That's good, because the anterior pituitary wants to release enough FSH to stimulate the growth of one follicle, but not 10 follicles. You don't want to have 10 potential eggs that could be fertilized, because humans can't do that. Humans have a hard enough time growing 3 babies in their uterus. Growing, 4 or 5 or 2 or 10 is not good. So typically, one follicle starts to grow. It produces enough estradiol to feed back and shut down the production of more FSH and LH. Okay, but that growth of the secretion of estradiol starts to target the uterus and tells the uterus, hey, start growing your endometrium, get it going. It supports the growth of the endometrium. So the endometrial lining starts to grow and develop because of that estradiol. And as these follicular cells grow, they start secreting more and more and more estradiol. So I'm going to put E here. That, I'm going to add an extra arrow here, that continues to support the growth of the endometrium at the uterus. So you need to add a little arrow there. So now we're maybe on day 5, day 6, day 7, day 8, day 9 of the cycle. And here's something interesting. When we get a large amount of estradiol, this has a positive feedback on the hypothalamus. What does that usually do? It causes the hypothalamus to release more gonadotropin releasing hormone. That positive feedback, when there's a lot of estradiol, causes the hypothalamus to go, oh my gosh, I better release more gonadotropin releasing hormone. Now we're about mid-cycle, all right? So this is about day 12, day 10, day 10, day 12, day 13, something around then. And I want to go back and look at what we've done so far. Ooh, this is a little messy. So far we're looking at, if we look here, the hypothalamus causes the anterior pituitary to release FSH. We get an increase in FSH initially, then it drops off. Okay, we get a slight increase in LH the whole time. That causes the growth of one follicle. The production of estradiol increases as the follicle grows and grows. All right, and that estradiol helps support the growth of the endometrium down here. Then we get to mid-cycle. Let's go back down to our growth, our flow chart here. So around day 10 to 15, the hypothalamus releases a whole bunch of gonadotropin-releasing hormone. That causes the anterior pituitary to release this surge of FSH and LH. So the anterior pituitary releases a lot of LH, and you can put FSH in there too, but a surge of LH. And if you go back and look at the slide here, you see this big peak here. That's what we're talking about, a surge of LH. That's what is happening right around the middle of the cycle. So you might want to put a surge of LH between the anterior pituitary and the ovary, because that surge of LH, luteinizing hormone, targets the ovary, where it causes a few things to happen. One of the things it does is it targets the ovary to cause the maturation of the secondary oocyte. The egg matures, and as the egg matures, it's ovulated. So this surge of the luteinizing hormone causes ovulation. Oops, I wrote ovulated, but it causes the egg to be ovulated. Okay, ovulation has happened somewhere around day 10 to 15 of your cycle. What else does LH do? LH is called the luteinizing hormone. What luteinizing hormone does is at the ovary it stimulates the transformation and maintenance of the follicle cells into the gland called the corpus luteum. Remember that after the egg is ovulated, what's left behind, those follicle cells left behind, become their own gland and start making their own hormones? Well, it's LH, or luteinizing hormone, that targets the ovary, that tells those follicle cells, okay, now you're your own gland, you're called the corpus luteum, we're going to maintain you. So the LH helps to maintain that corpus luteum. The corpus luteum starts pumping out its own hormones. It pumps out estradiol and progesterone. Okay? And if we look at the chart, over here, we should see, after the cycle, halfway through the cycle, we should see, we're looking down here now, we should see an increase in both estradiol and progesterone, and we do, right? That increase in estradiol and progesterone targets the endometrium and promotes thickening and maintenance of the endometrium. So let's write that in. So it targets the uterus and maintains the endometrium. So right in there, endometrium. I'm not going to have room for it. Okay. It also feeds back on the brain with a negative feedback system. The brain's like, whoa, I got to slow things down a little because we've got a lot of estradiol and progesterone going on here. And so when this negative feedback hits the brain starts, the anterior pituitary starts to slow the release of FSH and LH. Slow down. Okay, we don't need so much FSH and LH anymore. But wait a minute. The corpus luteum is maintained by the LH coming from the anterior pituitary. So if there's less LH coming from the anterior pituitary, what's going to happen to the corpus luteum? Corpus luteum is in the ovary. It's that gland in the ovary that makes estradiol and progesterone. Well, this corpus luteum depends on FSH and LH from the anterior pituitary. But when inhibition of FSH and LH happens, the corpus luteum starts to fall apart. It starts to shrivel up. And as it shrivels up, it stops making its own hormones. Well, what hormones did it make again? Come back up here. Remember that the corpus luteum was making estradiol and progesterone. So then you see a drop in estradiol and progesterone. This is kind of toward the end of our cycle. You know, maybe day 20, day 25, day 26, something like that. Okay? Okay. If there's less estradiol and progesterone, what's going to happen to the uterus? At the uterus, the endometrium has been depending on estradiol and progesterone. But now the uterus, the endometrium can't be supported anymore. It starts to die off. It starts to fall apart, and it is shed, and we're back to day 1. We're back to menstruation, or the period that happens at day 1 or day 0, if you will. So the endometrium can no longer be maintained because there's not enough progesterone and estradiol. But when there's not much estradiol or progesterone, this negative feedback system here also is not maintained, right? And so FSH and LH are no longer inhibited. And the anterior pituitary could be like, all right, I can start making some FSH again. And we get the growth of a follicle. On day 0, we get the start of another follicle growing. We're back to the beginning of the cycle. We're back to the left-hand side of the screen here, where we start all over with the growth of a follicle. This is about day 0, day 1, day 2, something like that in the cycle. Whew. That is a lot of coordination. You should understand this to some extent. I want you to think about this picture as showing what happens when there is no pregnancy, right? So that this cycle happens over and over and over again with no pregnancy. I had a couple of comments before we wrap up today's lecture. So how does hormonal birth control, like the pill or a patch or a vaginal ring, those kinds of things, how do they work? Typically, a pill will have a combination of estradiol and progesterone. So like synthetic versions. Sometimes it just has progesterone, but usually it's a combination, all right? And when you get a combination of estradiol and progesterone, that feeds back on the brain. We're over here making estradiol and progesterone. Feeds back on the brain and kind of shuts down the reproductive system. Okay? It prevents the release of GnRH. It prevents the release of FSH. And with no FSH, the follicle is not going to grow. It's not going to mature. And certainly with no LH, you're not going to get ovulation. So even if a follicle does grow, it's not ovulated. So hormonal birth control prevents the growth of a follicle. It prevents the ovulation of a follicle because it gives the brain like a little bit of estradiol and progesterone all the time. Does that make sense? What about emergency contraception? So you've had unprotected sex and you're like, oh no, I need to do something. Yes, you can. There's the morning after pill, Plan B. What that does is it contains progesterone that prevents ovulation. A big dose of progesterone, that's going to prevent you from ovulating. That's good if you want to have contraception after unprotected sex. Or a copper IUD, which is an intrauterine device that can be inserted into the uterus, can prevent the sperm from fertilizing the egg or prevent a fertilized egg from being implanted. And that can happen after unprotected sex too. So it's considered emergency contraception. So these are both contraception. They prevent pregnancies. There is something called the RU486 pill that isn't contraception. It ends a pregnancy, so it's a pregnancy ender, basically, and it's a combination of 2 medicines. One of them prevents progesterone. Progesterone is absolutely required or necessary for the growth of an embryo, okay? The second one causes contractions, so the embryo dies and it's expulsed, right? So this is not an example of contraception. These first 2 are definitely examples of contraception that prevent ovulation or typically preventing ovulation. Okay, I think we're going to stop here and we'll start another lecture on pregnancy. Oh, what happens if there's a pregnancy? Oh yeah, that's right. There's more to the female reproductive system that we need to deal with. Okay, oops, so we'll talk later.